Biden's problems are compounding. The Chinese hackers are a menace. But the bigger worry is the debt ceiling crisis. It's like a ticking time bomb for America's economy. Next week, the American government could default. For weeks, Biden has been trying to convince Republicans he wants a new credit line to keep his government running. And it seems Biden may finally have a breakthrough.
Speaker McCarthy and I have had several productive conversations, and our staffs continue to meet as we speak, as a matter of fact, and they're making progress.
They're making progress. No deal yet, but the negotiations continue. Honestly, they don't have much time. America is literally on the brink of an economic catastrophe, a government default. It hasn't happened in America's history. Everyone is concerned, including the American armed forces.
I think there's no doubt whatsoever that there would be a very significant negative impact on the readiness, morale, and capabilities of the United States military if we defaulted.
A default cannot happen. They're speaking in loud and clear terms. That message is for America's politicians. The time for bickering is over. They need to act. And they seem to be hearing. A compromise solution is in the works. We have some specifics. Some reports have come out. They say America's debt ceiling could be raised for 2 years. The debt ceiling is the upper limit on government debt, so the Biden government will be able to borrow more, but they'll have to give up on some things, like spending on discretionary programs. This includes house and education schemes. There will be a cap on spending in these areas. What else? Some of the money will be redirected. More money will flow towards the military and veterans. We'll have to wait for the exact numbers. The agreement is still being hammered out. But if a deal is struck, this is what it could look like. So we could see an end to this impasse soon. Perhaps the US will narrowly avoid the default. However, the deadlock is already causing damage. America's credibility is taking a hit. Credit rating agencies have issued warnings they could downgrade America's debt. DBRS Morningstar has put the US under review. They could consider a downgrade. Other leading agencies like Fitch, Moody's, and Scope have raised similar warnings. That's not all. Experts are worried. This political impasse could have more consequences. The US economy could enter a recession. The economists are worried about the spending cuts. They feel the curbs could last for multiple years. And if government spending is cut, the American economy will feel the impact. There could be a recession in 2024. There are warnings about jobs too. The spending cuts could lead to layoffs. Going by one estimate, as many as 570,000 jobs are at risk. The proposals by Republicans to limit spending can reduce America's GDP by 0.8% and boost unemployment by 0.4%. Those are the estimates. Again, this entirely depends on what kind of deal the Democrats and the Republicans agree upon. But compromises will be made. That's a guarantee. Guess who will bear the brunt for this? Joe Biden, the US president. The spending cuts will impact his domestic agenda. Biden has projected himself as the president for the middle class. He is called Middle Class Joe for the same reason. And he is running on the same platform for 2024. The budget curbs will affect his re-election chances. Biden knows that. He's trying to protect the middle class from the budget cuts.
But Speaker McCarthy and I have a very different view of who should bear the burden of additional efforts to get our fiscal house in order. I don't believe the whole burden should fall on the backs of middle class and working class Americans. My House Republican friends disagree.
So that's the disagreement. The stakes are high for Biden. The budget crisis can not only upend his re-election campaign, but also plunge America into a recession. Meanwhile, even as China publicly preaches peace, it seems like it's all prepared for war, using its standard tool, cyber espionage. A report by Microsoft says that critical US infrastructure has been compromised. It blames a state-backed Chinese hacker group dubbed Volt Typhoon. What has this group been doing? Not exactly the explosive activity their name would suggest. Instead, they've been playing the long game. Since at least 2021, Volt Typhoon has been infiltrating network systems across the US. They've been keeping a low profile. maintaining a discreet presence, almost as if lying in wait for the right time to strike. And their choice of targets is also of interest. Besides the US mainland, Volt Typhoon is infiltrating systems in the island of Guam. Our next report brings you the details.
It seems every other week, Chinese hackers are in the news. That too, state-sponsored Chinese hackers, Beijing's shady right hand. They have various nicknames in the intelligence community. We told you about backdoor diplomacy a few days ago and their activities in Kenya. Today, we'll talk about Volt Typhoon, China's sleeper cell of hackers. On Wednesday, Microsoft issued a warning. It found that Volt Typhoon had infiltrated critical US infrastructure. They'd been targeting every sector imaginable across the US, from standard ones like communications, government and transportation, to manufacturing, construction, and even education, basically covering all the bases. And where is Volt Typhoon embedding itself? All over the US and its Pacific Island territory of Guam. Guam is basically a US military colony in the Pacific Ocean. It's at this strategic location close to Japan, the Philippines, and Taiwan. Its position makes it a hub for communication between the US and Asia and Australia. Guam is also within striking distance of Taiwan in case China decides to invade. So you can see why Beijing would have eyes on it. And according to Microsoft, Volt Typhoon is hacking Guam's infrastructure. This will be crucial in the event of an armed conflict. The hackers could use their access to disable communication at a critical moment. It could temporarily blind the US and its allies, creating a window for a Chinese lightning strike. Now, you may wonder, how has Volt Typhoon managed to infiltrate US infrastructure? Doesn't hacking usually mean a quick attack to steal valuable information? Well, Microsoft says the group is using what's called living off the land techniques. This isn't the usual method of targeting people to steal passwords for access. Instead, Volt Typhoon operates with stealth. It manually issues commands over the network, steals credentials from local systems, blends into normal network activity, and even uses open source tools to gain access. That's a lot of jargon. The basic point is this: Volt Typhoon works quietly and maintains access over a long period of time. It doesn't create any waves or leave any digital footprints behind. This makes it difficult to know exactly what it has access to. The only real solution is to change passwords or close accounts frequently. All this was revealed by Microsoft on Wednesday. It set off a flurry of activity in Western security establishments.
We are aware of recent activity by a People's Republic of China sponsored cyber actor to develop a presence in digital networks across the U.S. critical infrastructure sector. The U.S. government and close allies have released a joint cybersecurity advisory to help defenders identify and mitigate any such activity on their networks. And the U.S. intelligence community assesses that China almost certainly is capable of launching cyber attacks that could disrupt critical infrastructure services within the United States, including against oil and gas pipelines and rail systems.
Which nations are shoring up their defenses? The US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. In intelligence circles, they're sometimes collectively referred to as the Five Eyes Alliance. This group was actually formed during World War II and has persisted ever since. Yesterday, China sent a message to the Five Eyes.
Obviously, this is a collective disinformation operation initiated by the United States and mobilized by the Five Eyes countries out of geopolitical purposes. As we all know, the Five Eyes Alliance is the largest alliance organization in the world, and the US National Security Agency is the largest hacking organization in the world. The fact that they teamed up to publish a disinformation report is ironic in itself. As for the participation of certain companies at this time, it shows that in addition to government agencies, the United States is also expanding new channels for disseminating disinformation. This is not the first time, nor will it be the last.
China then went on to accuse the US of being a hacker empire. It cited an incident from last September, saying the US had tried to hack a Chinese university. That doesn't really prove China's innocence, though. It just makes it seem as though everyone's hacking everyone else, which could very well be the case. But this Microsoft report proves one thing, though. The US and the West need to improve their cybersecurity, or risk being a target for an information blackout on Beijing's command.
Russia is making bold moves near Ukraine. Moscow is finally resorting to its nuclear options. Tactical warheads are being moved to Belarus. The plan was announced back in March. So far, the Kremlin hadn't acted on it, but today it finally pulled the trigger. Russian nuclear weapons are going to Belarus.
The transfer of nuclear weapons has begun.
It has already begun.
Yes, it has already begun.
The weapons are already in Belarus.
Maybe. I'll take a look when I go back.
That was Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus and a loyal ally of Vladimir Putin. Lukashenko has kept his promise. His country is now playing host to Russian nukes. The West has denounced these deployments. What made Putin resort to nuclear weapons? What is the Russian president's endgame? Let's deep dive. The war in Ukraine is in its 15th month, and both sides are battling for every inch of territory. A counter-offensive by Ukraine could begin soon, which some say has already started. But Russia is preparing. Moscow is responding with nuclear weapons. The plan was announced back in March. Belarus said today the warheads are on the move. Who are these weapons for? Ukraine. That's a no-brainer. But there could be more targets. Look at the map. Belarus shares a border with 3 NATO members, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. So these countries too can be potential targets. What kind of warheads are these? Tactical warheads. They are small in size and they are used for a limited strike. So they won't be able to destroy big cities, but they can obliterate small areas. That's their purpose. The nukes in Belarus will be controlled by Russia. So no change in ownership. But if a nuclear strike is ordered, Belarus could execute it on Russia's orders. They were given missiles that can carry these warheads. Some aircraft have been converted too. Belarusian Sukhoi 25 will be able to carry nukes. The Sukhoi 25 is a Russian warplane. The Air Force of Belarus has them. In their fleet, Belarusian servicemen got some training too. So everything is in place. The question is, why now? The Russian defense minister has dropped some hints. He was in Minsk to finalize some specifics about this arrangement to store the nukes. Listen to his comments. The collective West is essentially waging an undeclared war against our countries. The West was doing all it could to prolong and escalate the armed conflict in Ukraine. Allow me to simplify that. Russia says the war in Ukraine has turned into a proxy battle and the West wants to extend the conflict by arming the Ukrainian forces. That's the allegation by Russia. So the nukes are deterrents, a way for Russia to take control and perhaps influence the outcome of this war. The US has called Russia's move irresponsible.
I would say that we strongly condemn the arrangement. As we have made clear, the use of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons in this conflict would be met with severe consequences.
Washington has condemned the move. But what are they doing to stop Moscow? Will it change its own nuclear posture? Will America reinforce its own nuclear deterrence? The answer to that question is a no. For now, the US has decided to do nothing.
We have not seen any reason to adjust our own nuclear posture. You've heard us say that before, nor any indications Russia is preparing to use nuclear weapons for Belarus. Speaking to that particular issue, this is yet another example of making irresponsible and provocative choices. So we remain committed to collective defense of the NATO alliance, and I'll just leave it there.
So the US won't change its posture, but its ally, Japan, thinks differently. They are worried about Russia's nukes. Today, Tokyo announced fresh sanctions on Moscow. They condemned Russia's actions too.
We are aware of the announcement by both Russia and Belarus. As the only country to have suffered atomic bombings during wartime, Japan never accepts Russia's nuclear menace, let alone its use.
A nuclear menace. Japan is not mincing its words there. Expect this war of words to intensify. What about the actual war in Ukraine? Well, the fighting is escalating. Today, Russia targeted Kiev again. More missiles and drones were launched towards Ukraine's capital. Ukraine said it shot down 10 missiles and 25 drones. There were no casualties. Russia is making moves in Crimea too. This week, Russian officials seized an apartment there. Guess who it belonged to? Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Reports say the property will be auctioned. But these small measures will hardly matter. Russian nukes are now not just near Ukraine, but they are close to NATO's borders too. For the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has deployed these bombs outside the country. It's a move that cannot be taken lightly. This war is about to enter a dangerous phase. Now let's focus on something else that kills people: disease. Specifically, let's talk about what's concerning the World Health Organization. Disease X, the next pandemic. This isn't a specific disease. It's a warning about the future. The WHO says that another pandemic will definitely come. Disease X, whatever it is, may be worse than the Wuhan virus. And the world needs to be prepared. And the WHO is right, because this disease X may not be too far away. In fact, it may be closer and more familiar to us than expected. Earlier this month, the WHO had declared that the Wuhan virus was no longer a public health emergency, but it had warned people not to become complacent. It was still out there, mutating, biding its time. It had the potential to strike back. So could it be that the Wuhan virus has actually returned as the dreaded disease X? Because the cases are rising again. Back where it all began, China. A report.
The annual World Health Assembly is taking place in Geneva. It comes just weeks after the World Health Organization said the Wuhan virus is no longer a public health emergency. That was earlier this month. But at the time, the WHO warned the world not to become complacent.
The worst thing any country could do now is to use this news as a reason to let down its guard, to dismantle the systems it has built, or to send the message to its people that COVID-19 is nothing to worry about.
This week, the WHO issued another warning. It told the world not to delay the reforms needed to prepare for the next pandemic.
We cannot kick this can down the road. If we do not make the changes that must be made, then who will? And if we do not make them now, and when? When the next pandemic comes knocking, and it will, we must be ready to answer decisively, collectively, and equitably.
He said, when the next pandemic comes knocking, and it will, there's no doubt. The WHO has come up with a designation for the future pathogen, Disease X. We don't know what it is exactly, where it comes from, where it will strike, but Disease X will cause the next pandemic. And it will be even deadlier than the Wuhan virus. It doesn't seem to be on the WHO's radar yet. The agency released this list of priorities. As you can see, Disease X comes in at number 9. That basically means that even though we don't know what it is, the WHO is keeping its eyes open, watching out for any indication that Disease X has arrived. Of course, that may just be too optimistic from the WHO, because Disease X may not be something entirely new. We say this because the Wuhan virus has mutated again, and cases are on the rise. The Wuhan virus is once again going rampant in China. Estimates say that by the end of June, China will see as many as 65 million cases per week. This figure was quoted by the country's top respiratory disease expert, Zhong Nanshan. In fact, he said that infections could hit 40 million a week right now. The variant behind the rise is the XBB. It's another of the endless Omicron subvariants. Chinese state media says XBB has led to 80% of the new infections in China. China's National Health Commission says XBB has greater transmissibility and immune escape than earlier strains of Omicron. The country even recently approved 2 new vaccines targeting XBB. Despite this, China says there's nothing to worry about. State mouthpiece Global Times released this report today. It says there will be limited impact, but believe China at your own risk. The US Department of Health quite clearly doesn't. Its National Institutes of Health, or NIH, released this report yesterday. It says about 10% of those analyzed experienced long-term symptoms or long COVID after 6 months. These were all Omicron patients. So, even though the pandemic is over, the danger hasn't passed. Not while the Wuhan virus continues to mutate. It's not certain that the WHO's dreaded disease X will be a variant of the Wuhan virus, but there's no guarantee that it won't be. China needs to stop underplaying the problem and work with the world. The last thing we need is the dragon releasing yet another pandemic.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. A South Korean plane's door opened during a flight. It landed safely. Hundreds of people took to the streets of Bolivia to demand action on sexual abuse allegations that have rocked the country's Catholic Church. A 76-year-old man in India's Kerala narrowly escaped disaster after his mobile phone, kept in his shirt pocket, burst and caught fire spontaneously. And speaking of India, the country is all set to inaugurate its new parliament. The ceremony will take place on Sunday. The images have been released. And now let's take you back in history to the year 1940. What happened today on May 26th? This day witnessed one of UK's most heroic episodes in the Second World War. Britain began a huge seaborne evacuation, an escape from a potentially disastrous defeat at the hands of Hitler's army. Over 300,000 British and French soldiers were evacuated. We're leaving you with these images. Thank you so much for watching. Have a happy weekend.
Dog-tired, hungry, but their spirit was never broken. Their ranks were solid to the end. Earned themselves a new name, the Unbreakable by rail in Britain. Tired, but there was a non-stop buffet all ready for by the most terrible battle of all time. No, you can't beat a nation that breeds men like...
The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.